Hello, welcome. I'm Ellen Horstman. I'm with Camden, Arkansas First United Methodist Church, and I welcome you to our Sunday school lesson as we continue looking at a book by the Reverend Rob Fuquay that's called The Passion Play, Living the Story of Christ's Last Days. And of course, as I've told you before, it's based on the Passion Play in Oberammergau, Germany. Now, the marvelous thing about this play is that the people made a vow in that village in 1633 that every 10 years this passion play would be enacted. And the first one was enacted in 1634, and they're still doing them. Unfortunately, the Oberammergau play had a dark side, and that dark side was its anti-Semitism. Passion plays tended to be anti-Semitic, at least the ones that developed during the Middle Ages, and they were very popular in the Middle Ages and ran on up into modern times. They based that anti-Semitism, they take the verse from Matthew chapter 27, where Pilate has just told people, well, I'm going to wash my hands of the blood of this man, and then the people in the crowd say, his blood be on us and on our children. And so the people that formed these passion plays would make Pilate look like an almost innocent and very reluctant person agreeing to the crucifixion, and make it seem as if the fault for the crucifixion of Jesus lay with the Jewish people, those Jewish people who said, let the blood be on us. And so many towns that enacted passion plays would have so much anti-Semitism in them. They'd do things like they started putting horns on the hats of the Jewish elders and so forth. And so they had so much anti-Semitism in them that frequently when a play was produced, it would inflame passions and there would be outbreaks of violence against the Jewish people that lived in the community. So bad were these outbreaks of violence in the city of Rome that in the 16th century, the city of Rome outlawed or banned all passion plays because of the attacks on the Jews. Well, Oberammergau was definitely one of the plays that had a lot of anti-Semitism in it. In 1634, let me get this right. In 1934, Oberammergau had a special showing of the Passion Play to mark the 300th anniversary. And in August, Adolf Hitler attended with a great deal of fanfare. It was a big deal. There were articles in the paper. There were pictures. Much was made over Hitler's coming. By this time, he had consolidated power in Germany and was beginning to be more and more of a dictator and beginning to say more and more things, attacking people, especially Jewish people, but also gypsies and other people, any who were non-Aryans. And thinking people, critical people, were very concerned about Hitler's rhetoric here. But he was rather popular in Bavaria, which is where Oberammergau is. The people had had a lot of economic problems. They saw Hitler as a way to get rid of the problems that had been left them, the scars and the economic difficulties that were a result of World War I. And as Fuquay puts it, by this time, Hitler's star power was rising to the level of a demigod. This is what happens sometimes, especially when we put all our trust in one person, or when we let that person start attacking other groups so it makes us feel better about ourselves. So Hitler came to see the play, and he really loved the play, and he really pushed the play. And he approved of its scripts. They ended up getting Nazis involved in some of the production of it. Here's what he said about the play in 1942 to just give you a feel for how he loved it. He said, it is vital that the Passion Play be continued at Oberammergau, for never has the menace of Jewry been so convincingly portrayed as in this presentation of what happened in the time of the Romans. There one sees in Pontius Pilate a Roman racially and intellectually so superior that he stands out like a firm, clean rock in the middle of the whole muck and mire of Jewry. So you see how anti-Semitic the play was and how it was used as an anti-Semitic symbol by the likes of Hitler. Well, even after World War II, unfortunately, the play continued to retain some of its anti-Semitic lines and its anti-Semitism. I just read an article that was published this year in The Atlantic. I think it was in August. And in it, A.J. Goldman writes that after, let's see here, that the anti-Semitism continued in the play, and it was only after, and I'm quoting him now, after the Vatican withheld its Missio Canica, which is the official authorization for preaching, in 1970, the play's organizers made overtures to the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee, inviting them to participate in discussing amendments to the play. But while some nips and tucks were made here and there, including the removing of the horn-shaped hats by the high priest, it wasn't until 1986 when a new director, Christian Stuckel, took over. Then he was only in his mid-20s, but he was elected by the town council with a one-vote majority. And it was only then, in 1986, that the Oberammergau Passionspiel began to modernize. So you see, anti-Semitism has been part of the ugly chapter. The script, over time, under the leadership of its current director, has been changed to show Jesus as an observant Jew. It'll have scenes of Jesus entering the temple, reciting the Shema, which is an everyday prayer of the Jewish people. It has Jesus and his disciples doing Sabbath blessings. It has some of the proper ritual around the Passover supper when they're together for the Last Supper. And it's all done against the background of Roman occupation. So essentially, what's happening here is, under the direction of Director Stuckel, Oberammergau is trying to tell a better story. The anti-Semitism that was in this play, and I must say in much of the Western world, was just one form of prejudice. But by trying to take it out of the story and trying to depict Jesus in this play now as a Jewish person, a Jewish leader, a person, back to Mr. Goldman in his article that he wrote in 22, he says that the play depicts Jesus as someone who wants to reform Judaism from within, rather than found a whole new religion, all against the backdrop of a repressive Roman occupation. And what he's saying is that Jesus is not depicted as somebody who wants to throw the Jews out, which would have been crazy for Jesus to do since he was himself Jewish. But the anti-Semitism in this play, which we find, I hope you find, reprehensible, unfortunately, is only one form of prejudice that we find over time, or that we even find in our world today. I mean, basically, a false narrative comes along. In this case, it was a twisting of the gospel story that helped to perpetuate a deadly prejudice. Well, unfortunately, like I said, anti-Semitism is not, in and of itself, it's not dead. We've seen in our own country in the last few years a continued rise in anti-Semitic remarks and anti-Semitic attacks. We've seen attacks against Muslims. We've seen attacks against people who are Asian. And you know, we've actually become a people who are rather accustomed to hearing people call for violence and even death against members of the opposite political party. As Reverend Fuquay says, prejudice often prospers from false narratives that get passed down. Eventually, those narratives become our reality. They become a convenient way to explain our problems by blaming someone else. And so, as Reverend Fuquay says, the only way that these prejudice and negative attitudes towards groups of people can change is if we begin telling a better story. With that in mind, I want to look at Luke chapter 9, verses 51 through 56. Luke chapter 9, verses 51 through 56. As the time approached when Jesus was to be taken up to heaven, he determined to go to Jerusalem. He sent messengers on ahead of him. Along the way, they entered a Samaritan village to prepare for his arrival. But the Samaritan villagers refused to welcome him because he was determined to go to Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to call fire from heaven down to consume them?" But Jesus turned and spoke to them sternly, and they went on to another village. Okay, now why am I reading this when I've been talking about prejudice? Well, obviously, there is some prejudice on the part of these disciples, these apostles of Jesus, as they're going through Samaria. Now, you may be familiar with the fact that the Samaritans, they were the people of that one kingdom that had stayed behind, not stayed behind, when they were pulled off to the Assyrian exile. The Samaritans from the northern kingdom, the ones who were left there, had intermarried and intermixed with the pagan people. And so the people from the southern kingdom who remained behind and those who came back from the exile, they looked down on these former Jews because they felt that they no longer were pure. They had mixed in with some of the local people that were non-Jewish people. And so they didn't like the Samaritans, but the Samaritans didn't like the Jewish people either. And so here, as they're coming through here, they refused to give hospitality to Jesus. Interestingly, it doesn't say because he was Jewish, but rather because he was going to Jerusalem. He was going down into the southern kingdom where all those Jews lived. And his disciples get so angry about the lack of hospitality that they, at least James and John, they want to call down fire upon him. Well, Jesus tells a better story. He begins to change their prejudice by telling a better story. Not right away, but very shortly thereafter, we hear the story that you and I nowadays call the story of the Good Samaritan. Let's get at the very beginning of this passage where you have a lawyer coming in to talk to Jesus, and this is in the 10th chapter. A legal expert, it's called in this translation, a lawyer and some others, but a legal expert stood up to test Jesus and said, "Teacher, what must I do to gain eternal life?" And Jesus replied, "What's written in the law, and how do you interpret it?" He responded, "Well, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus said, "You've answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But the legal expert, wanting to prove that he was right, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" So who is my neighbor? Well, you know how Jesus answers. He doesn't answer directly. He begins to tell a story about a man who was beaten and left on the road by robbers, about how a priest passes by and doesn't stop, a Levi passes by and doesn't stop, and finally, who does stop? Of all people, a Samaritan, the ones that all these Jewish people look down on. The same group of people that James and John had been wanting to call fire down on. And of course, the Samaritan has compassion on the man. He tends to his wounds. He takes him to an inn and takes care of him. And then when he has to go on about his business, he pays the innkeeper to take care of this man and says, "I'll pay you more, whatever more I owe you when I come back." And so as Jesus concludes this story, his little story that he's told, he looks at the legal expert and he says to him, let me see if I can find it here in verse, hang on a second. Okay, it looks like it's verse 36. "What do you think?" said Jesus. "Which one of these three was a neighbor to the man who encountered thieves?" And then the legal expert said, "Well, the one who demonstrated mercy toward him." And then Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." So what Jesus is doing is teaching us to be a better neighbor. He's teaching people to be a better neighbor. I want you to notice that, he threw this Samaritan in there, Jesus did in his story. And when he asked the lawyer which one of these was a better neighbor, the lawyer answers, but he doesn't actually say the Samaritan. He just says, the one that showed compassion. Jesus, as Fuquay said, and I thought this was kind of an interesting idea from him, He said that when the lawyer asked the question, he asked Jesus, "What must I do to gain eternal life?" But then Jesus asked a question as he finishes his story, and his question is, which one of these people proves to be, which one was a better neighbor? So we've moved from doing to being, to what we are, or to our essence. And then when the lawyer answers him, Jesus says, "Go and do likewise." So as Fuquay puts it, what we do comes from who we are. But friends, here in this story, Jesus is teaching us what being a neighbor means. Jesus is teaching us how we are to love, and I would say who we are to love, which is pretty much everyone from this. By choosing a Samaritan as a good guy, Jesus is taking the story and not just teaching this lawyer about what it means to be a good neighbor, and not just teaching him and us that everyone is our neighbor, but he's basically telling a better story about those Samaritans, the people that his own disciples were prejudiced against. I mean, sure, Jesus wanted all people to hear these things and reflect on those things and reflect on their own prejudices. But maybe, and this was an idea I got from Fuquay that I just thought was intriguing, maybe Jesus also was particularly choosing a Samaritan because he wanted to tell a better story for his apostles and teach them to hear and to live a better story. You know, when Jesus was snubbed in Samaria, and let me talk about that being snubbed. You may be aware of this, that hospitality was considered like a key virtue, and to not be hospitable to someone was about the worst thing you could do in that culture at that time. And the Samaritans were not hospitable to Jesus. They would not help with food and drink. And so that's why the disciples wanted to rain down fire on them. But what Jesus is doing there is making them, when he tells this story and puts a Samaritan in there, he's getting his apostles to confront their own prejudices, to think about their own expectations, and to look at their way of judging an entire group of people based on the experience with a handful of people. Well, I have a question for you. Are we guilty of prejudices? Or, if it makes you feel better to say that, could we possibly have some biases? Could we possibly be judging people or judging whole groups of people? I mean, maybe we don't stereotype or dislike or ignore people based on race. Maybe we aren't so, like the Ober Ammergau place, so anti-Semitic in its inception. Maybe we're not that bad anymore. But maybe we do put people in categories and make assumptions about them. I mean, look at the kind of divisiveness we have in this country nowadays. We've gone beyond just dividing and being biased against people based on race or gender animosities, which are not good things. But we Americans have even taken to demonizing the people who are in the opposite political party from ourselves. That's become every day. And friends, I'm afraid to say, no, I'm not afraid to say this, I'm sorry to say this, we can see this kind of judging and demonizing in our own United Methodist denomination. I mean, if you're a United Methodist, you know that there's a big split going on right now where some churches are deciding to pull out and to leave the United Methodist Church, and where in that process you have discernment going on, as it's called. But if you look at social media, you'll see people on both sides of the issue making disparaging remarks about the opposite and questioning their Christianity. This story from Jesus reminds us that everyone is our neighbor, that we need to tell a better story, that we need to take a hard look at ourselves, and we need to write, or I should say, tell a better story. The story of Elizabeth Eckford and Hazel Bryant is one that came to my mind today when I was thinking about telling a better story. Now, if you don't know who they are, Elizabeth Eckford was one of the Little Rock Nine. And there's a famous picture of her that you've probably seen at some point. This all happened in 1957 when Little Rock Central was trying to be desegregated. And when white people were vehemently opposed to that, and our governor even called out the guard initially to keep these black children out of the school. Well, the 9 children were all going to go to the school on whatever day it was, but Daisy Bates had tried to get word to all of them that they would meet together and go in as a group, but Elizabeth hadn't gotten that word, so she went there by herself trying to get in, and the National Guard member turned her away, and crowds of white people got around her. They were teenagers, the kids that were going into the school, and started yelling horrible things, including suggesting that they take her to a tree and take care of this, well, I'm not going to use that word online. Anyway, the picture that was snapped shows Elizabeth, because she couldn't get into the school, so she turns around and she's walking away trying to go to the bus stop, and she's ringed by a crowd of people, and there are people behind her yelling at her, and you have this animate picture of a woman yelling, and just you can see all this is not a woman, let me say that again, a teenager yelling at her, obviously full of bile. You can see that on her face. Well, the woman who was doing the yelling and who was saying horrible things to Elizabeth was a lady named Hazel Bryant, she was at the time. After that picture came out all over the country, she started getting mail from people criticizing her for what she had done. Now think about it. She had been hearing all the adults around her talking about these terrible African Americans, black people, they used a different word for them, I'm sure, and how they were trying to come into school and ruin everything. So here was Hazel, who was about 15 or 16, and she was picking up on the stories that she'd heard all her life and the stories she was hearing then, and she was taking it out on this Elizabeth Eckford. But as she began to get these letters, to her credit, she began to seek a better story. She began actually going to the library, reading newspapers, seeing what the civil rights movement was all about, slowly changing her mind, so that by 1963 she felt that she had been wrong, and she felt so bad about it that she reached out to Elizabeth Eckford and apologized to her. Now 40 years later, in 1997, the original photographer decided, wouldn't it be great if he could get those 2 women together, Elizabeth and Hazel, for a picture. And as they met again, still again, Hazel apologized to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth graciously accepted. And for a while, they were friends. I mean, they actually became friends. They would go shopping together. They went to flower shows together. Elizabeth didn't have a car, so Hazel would drive her places. Now, I'd love to stop there with this. Isn't this a great story? It wasn't perfect. Because eventually they drifted apart because Elizabeth felt that Hazel was wanting too much from Elizabeth, that Hazel wanted her to kind of absolve Elizabeth of all her feelings of guilt. But this is still a better story, and it is an example of telling or writing a better story. And I say that because I see Hazel was able to go beyond the racial hatred that she had learned. She was able to go beyond the story, the stereotypes that she had learned all her life as she was growing up. She had decided to study about the civil rights movement and to reflect on her own biases. And she became active in peace activism and in social work. Author David Marglock, who wrote a biography of her, said that she taught mothering skills to unmarried black women and took underprivileged black teenagers on field trips. So Hazel had learned what Jesus teaches us in this story of the Good Samaritan. She had learned who is your neighbor. It's everyone. She had learned that she needed to tell a better story than the one that she was hearing all around her. And I'm going to pull this together here and end it by a reading from Reverend Fuquay. Here's what he says. We can live by narratives that tell us that some people deserve what they get. Because some have been mistreated, then mistreatment of others is justified. Some people who make dumb mistakes deserve what they get. My anger and outrage justify my calling down fire from heaven or throwing objects at someone. So we can live by those kind of narratives, says Reverend Fuquay. But as he goes on, but without any goodness in the narrative, a happy ending is hard to expect. Sometimes hope lies in fiction. Take a bad incident that infuriates and inflames us and rewrite the script. Imagine the other person not as an evil culprit, but as a child of God. Imagine what could have possibly made someone who was created in the image of a loving God act so unlovingly. Picture the person we despise not as someone hateful, prideful, or selfish, but as they could be, as God made them to be. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Change the narrative and reality can be changed. My friends, Jesus and Elizabeth and Reverend Fuquay are reminding us that we can tell a better story. Let us take time in prayer this week to take an honest assessment of our feelings toward other people and to begin, in the name of Jesus Christ, to tell a better story. For who is our neighbor? Everyone. Everyone that God loves. All of God's children. Have a blessed week, my friends. Bye-bye.